All right, welcome back to the channel. So Roy Jones Jr., this is Errol Spence Jr., says he ain't fought nobody and calls Terence Crawford #1 pound for pound. Man, Roy, what are you on, man? I love Roy as a fighter, but man, some of the things pop out his mouth, man, I just don't get. So let's get into it in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. So in this video, we're going to talk about the opinion of Roy Jones Jr. Roy Jones Jr., as you know, or you should know if you're a big fan of boxing, is a Hall of Fame fighter. He is one of the greatest fighters of this, definitely one of the greatest fighters of this century. Champion at 160, 168, 175, and heavyweight. Probably one of the smallest men ever to actually win a belt at heavyweight. Not the best fight in the world, you know, John Ruiz. I was actually at that fight. And Roy Jones Jr. is a little dude to be getting all the way up there and beating them big dudes. So terrific fighter, and somebody that many people consider to be the #1 pound for pound fighter for a long time. So when Roy Jones Jr. starts talking about who he thinks is the #1 pound for pound fighter in the world, man, it's reasonable to take him, you know, to listen to him and say, hey, man, you know, you take his opinion and you move with it. In this particular instance, man, I'm not feeling this. I'm not feeling it at all, man. And honestly, I think it's a bit of a prejudice on behalf of Roy Jones Jr. for Terence Crawford. And the reason that I say that, and I'll explain it, is I just think that Roy Jones Jr. sees a lot of Terence Crawford in himself, and he's giving Terence Crawford way too much credit, and he is not giving Errol Spence Jr. nearly the credit that he deserves. So, what is the reason that Roy Jones Jr. What did Roy Jones Jr. say? Roy was like, Errol Spence Jr. ain't fought nobody. I'm paraphrasing, right? He has not fought anybody. Haven't seen, don't know what he's about. But Terence Crawford is the #1 pound for pound fighter in the world, right? That was in a nutshell. What he's saying. Here's the problem. Here's the problem, man. All right, Errol Spence Jr. is a top welterweight, and Terence Crawford is a top welterweight. Both of them are. Errol Spence Jr. has 2 belts. Terence Crawford has 1 belt, right? Errol Spence Jr. in the 147-pound division is the top 147-pound fighter. Not just because he's got 2 belts, but because of the amount of work and the amount of the level of competition that the guy has been fighting. So for me, I don't think that there's a doubt whatsoever who the top welterweight is. It's Errol Spence Jr. Now, when you start talking about who the pound for pound best guy in the world is, you can have a bunch of talks about that, because really, you know, that is just, you know, what floats your boat, really. Do you like this or do you like that? What do you think about it? So the fact that Roy Jones Jr. would say that he believes that Terence Crawford is a #1 pound for pound fighter, I mean, it makes sense to me, because Roy Jones Jr. and Terence Crawford fight a lot alike. So I could see why Roy Jones Jr. might like his style more than he likes Errol Spence Jr.'s style, because Terence Crawford's style is very, very athletic. It's, you know, it's a pot-shotting style, but it is a very, very, you know, very, very, explosive style, similar to Roy Jones Jr. And in fact, you can tell from looking at Terence Crawford and the age of Terence Crawford that Terence Crawford grew up watching Roy Jones Jr. and patterned his game off Roy Jones Jr., you know, to a large degree. However, when you look at the skills, for me, if you look at the skills of Errol Spence and you look at the skills of Terence Crawford, Errol Spence Jr. is a more well-rounded, a more fundamentally sound, and a better fighter, especially when you match those two styles. Now, but the fact that, no, that's my opinion, right? So Roy Jones Jr. has his opinion about who he thinks is the best fighter, and I clearly do not have the in-ring experience that Roy Jones Jr. has. But, you know, hey, man, there's a lot of people that do, and they disagree. So I don't think it's unfair, or I don't think it's unreasonable for me to have a disagreement with him about it, as long as I respect his opinion about the pound-for-pound stuff. However, when you start talking about who's fought somebody and who hasn't fought anybody, that's just where Roy Jones Jr.'s facts are just off. I mean, just like you say, you know, the saying, you have the right to have your own opinion. You don't have the right to have your own facts. And the fact of the matter is, Errol Spence Jr. has fought, especially over the last 4 years, or really the last 5 years, He's fought significantly better competition than Terence Crawford has, and that is regardless of what weight class Terence Crawford was fighting at. Terence Crawford has been I do believe in August that it will be the third year that Terence Crawford has been in the welterweight division. 3 solid years, man. And he has not fought anybody of note in the last 3 years. If you look at the 2 years before that, really, Terence Crawford has not fought somebody that anybody really thought was a serious competition for him since Victor Postol, and that's going on 6 years, right? So, you know, to a certain extent, I understand where people are saying, you know, what his skill set looks like and all that, but when you compare him to Errol Spence Jr., you got to say, dude, what have you done for me lately? And you look at Errol Spence Jr. having just come off a fight with Danny Garcia, coming off of a car accident. Before that, having a fight with Sean Porter. Before that, having a fight with Mikey Garcia, Lamont Peterson, Kell Brook. There's nothing. There's just, sorry, man. It's just nothing on there that I see from Terence Crawford that compares to that. And the only justification that I think you could probably have for saying that Terence Crawford is better than him is just because you like his style more, right? But if you listen to Derek James, and I've listened to Derek, and I think Derek James, hey, man, when Derek James talks, I'll listen to Derek James. I'll listen to Roy Jones Jr., listen to Roy Jones Jr. But when Derek James is explaining the strengths of Terence Crawford, I'm listening to him, and he sounds just like he's prepared for Roy Jones Jr. Somebody that is very, very athletic, that gets loose with his technique. But because he has so much athleticism, he can make up for it. But that is not necessarily going to work with somebody that has a very, very high work rate, somebody that is just as athletic as you, and somebody that is just right. And also somebody that is not afraid to fight at a higher level. And that is something that Errol Spence Jr. has. He's not somebody that's going to come into the ring against Terence Crawford and feel like, you know, he's not going to get lost he's not going to be a deer in the headlight, right? So, I mean, I'm just not feeling it. And on top of it, Roy Jones Jr. is skipping something very, very important in this scenario. That Terence Crawford is just flat out ducking Errol Spence Jr. right now. Flat out ducking him, saying he doesn't want the fight. And we'll see after this Yordenis Ugas fight. If Errol Spence Jr. fights Yordenis Ugas, we will then see if Errol wins that fight, we will see what Terence Crawford is made of. Because if he doesn't immediately call for that fight and he starts gaming around and playing around with all like he's been doing for months and months and months, I just don't want to hear it, man. I don't have any. There's just no time for that. We should be going for the undisputed championship. To get one champion in the welterweight division. And Terence Crawford has never acted overly interested in getting at Errol Spence Jr. And I think the reason for that is because he understands what a danger Errol Spence Jr. is, and also all of the other stuff going on between Top Rank and, you know, Bob Arum and Al Heyman and all that other nonsense that's going on. But, you know, like I said, I got a lot of respect for Roy Jones Jr. I understand where Roy Jones Jr. is coming from. I can appreciate that. But, dude, like I said, you got the right to your own opinions. You don't have the right to your own facts. Terence Crawford ain't fought nobody in years, going on 6 years since Victor Postol, right? 6 years. Maybe you can say the Felix Diaz fight. If you include Felix Diaz and you think Felix Diaz is, then you're saying, okay, it's going on 5 years, right? But at this point, it's just over the top, man. Terence Crawford needs to fight somebody. He doesn't need to be called pound for pound for nothing. When you're fighting Kell Brook, when you're fighting an old, and I went for the Kell Brook fight just because it's like, at least the guy's got a name, but Kell Brook, Amir Khan, Jose Benavidez, Jeff Horn, nah, man. It's just not. Egis Kalvanakis, it's just not the level of competition where you should be celebrating the guy. But anyway, it is what it is. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.